For those of us who believe in the power of science and technology to improve our world, I think we can be really proud of the ongoing work to bring our lives back into some sort of normalcy. As you can see from this probably by now outdated slide that John Cumbers created earlier this week, we have something like over 20 antibodies, therapeutics for COVID in some phase of development, and on the order of 60, 70 vaccines in development as well, specifically against COVID-19 or against SARS-CoV-2. And the vaccine piece is particularly interesting because the current vaccine leaders are actually based on emerging technologies. The two that are the clear front runners, the Moderna and Pfizer, are based on a brand new, yet to be proven technology, which involves injecting the nucleic acid or mRNA that produces a particular viral product and induces an antibody response, rather than the more sort of classical methods of live attenuated vaccines and subunits that have been so successful in the past. And partly because of this, I would say that the timeline has been absolutely amazing. I mean, just look at the fact that essentially a year ago, we discovered this illness. The virus was sequenced this year. And by the summer, there were already phase 3 trials beginning, which is just absolutely astonishing. And so far, the early results are pretty exciting, as I'm sure you followed in the news this week. And here's a data slide from the submission of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, which you can see that the red line is the placebo, and the blue line is the number of infections after one dose of the vaccine. So really early encouraging results. So what's left to be done? I would argue quite a lot. And I think our panelists would too, not just for COVID-19, but for the current and future infectious diseases that humanity might face. So, in any case, I will let them go from here, and I'm pleased to introduce today's panel, which comprises a staggering range of expertise and accomplishment in the development of vaccines, ranging all the way from discovery science to investment. I have put some of their titles on the screen, but they really don't begin to capture the breadth of their experience. So I'm going to let each of them tell you a bit about themselves. So why don't, John, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. Thanks so much, Hemai, and Li Sheng for the opportunity to participate on what looks to be a very exciting panel. So my name is John Lewis. I'm the CEO of a company called Aegis Life, which is a spin out of one of my title companies, Entos Pharmaceuticals. But I guess my chosen profession is actually a professor. I'm a professor of oncology at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And it's actually an interesting story how I became involved now in this COVID-19 vaccine race. I've been passionate for many years on dissecting in my academic life the underpinnings of what makes cancer spread. And we focused on the genetics of it. And so over the past 10 years, we've developed a gene therapy platform that we call Fusogenics, but basically it combines the best aspects of non-viral technologies like Moderna's and BioNTech's with viral technologies, similar to some of the other groups like AstraZeneca and others using viruses. And so we were getting ready to start a first-in-human clinical trial for oncology using this platform when the pandemic hit. We looked at the field, and you mentioned there's all these emerging technologies in the vaccine field. We saw that we're really excited about the genetic technologies, the mRNA technologies, but we thought there was room for a vaccine that would have better storage and distribution capabilities. So we decided to use a very similar approach as Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera, but create a DNA vaccine. So we've been working basically nonstop since January of this year to bring a vaccine all the way from discovery to clinical trials.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. Una? Oh, you're on mute.
Hello. I'm a huge vaccine enthusiast, and I have a long history with vaccines going all the way from academia through biotech research and development and finally launch. But my first big success took 11 years to get Rotarix out. So I'm enormously impressed by and envious of the people who got it out in less than a year. I've chiefly been involved with infectious disease vaccines, but just to remind people, as John intimated, vaccines are much broader in their usefulness. I've been involved with vaccines to target autoimmune disease, to raise good cholesterol, and of course, to target cancers, particularly solid cancers that are difficult. But I just wanted to take sort of 3 learnings from my long time in the vaccine industry. And because I've also worked on other areas that I think will bear on the ultimate success of a COVID vaccine. Very early after my PhD, I worked in the area of blood control in the lungs, and I was able to localize ACE, now known as ACE1. And we know that ACE2 is the hijacked receptor for the spike protein, and it's also very widely distributed throughout the body. So I think it makes us think that we need to take in mind not only the point of entry of an infectious organism, but also the target receptor and its localization within the body. And I think if you think about it, it's a very long way from that tiny injection site to get all the way to the nose, where kids and adults are coughing and sneezing out virus. And, you know, there are other ways like intranasal and oral that in fact might be more useful. I think the second thing that I think we need to think about very hard is in the realm of, if we build it, will they come? You know, it's got to have confidence, be user-friendly, be cheap, transportable, and storable. I think cheap is incredibly important if we're going to deliver these worldwide, which we will need to do. And I've spent many years working on global health. And the last is really to think about, what is our societal strategy? We were talking about it a little bit before we came online, but are we trying to prevent people from dying and getting really sick with COVID, or are we trying to stop the pandemic? And I think we were targeting different things with the vaccine if we go for trying to protect individuals from trying to worry about the societal burden of a virus and worry about things like killing the virus, hobbling its replication, or preventing its transmission. So I would answer your slide, Hemi, yes, there's more to do. We need a raft of vaccines, but not maybe 3 or 4 that cover some of the points that I'm worried about. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Una. We will delve more into the what else do we need as we go on. Jenny, over to you. Love to hear a little bit about your background with Gates and the generation of your new fund.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks Propellex for having me, and looking forward to the panel today. I'm Jenny Yip. I'm a managing partner at Adjuvant Capital, which is a dedicated global health investment fund. We invest in mid to late clinical stage companies doing product research and development in drugs, vaccines, which is the topic of today, diagnostics and medical devices. And we really have a singular focus in global health. We try to target high burden and infectious diseases and sexual and reproductive health. And of course, infectious diseases is a really hot topic of this entire year. And we really try to support our companies in not only being responsive to a global pandemic, but also thinking about what are the future diseases that we can tackle out there that are affecting millions and millions of people worldwide. And if you look at our portfolio, most of them are still domiciled in the US and Europe because that's where the clinical innovations are. But what we really try to do is, to Una's point about making sure that there's access for everyone, is that the target customers or the target beneficiaries of these global health products have to be also in lower and middle income countries around the world. So yes, as you alluded to, we have a Gates background. We are sponsored and anchored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and that's also where I personally came from before founding Adjuvant.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, so let's delve a little bit more into this question of what's left to solve for these SARS-CoV-2 vaccines in particular. Jenny, why don't you actually just continue and maybe pick one issue that you feel is really important that we maybe haven't solved yet or need to be thinking more about?
Yeah, and I think just touched on this a little bit. For me, the practicalities of great, there's a vaccine that is now authorized, or hopefully soon to be authorized, in the U.S. and in the U.K. and Canada. But how does that vaccine, from a practical perspective, get from the manufacturing facility to arms of people who may be in lower resource settings that don't have ultra cold freezers? And yes, of course, we can completely redo the ultra cold chain in the entire world, but that is probably not practical in the next 6 to 9 months. And so what are the other vaccine constructs, perhaps using some of the more traditional ways in like a viral vector approach or an attenuation approach, that you will be able to get these vaccines into the hands of folks around the world, whether it's on a little cooler on the back of a bicycle, or even in just a normal fridge as opposed to an ultra cold fridge. So I think oftentimes about the TPP and how, practically speaking, we can do some of those things. So.
I think, John, that might tee you up for one of the virtues of your potential vaccine, eh?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a super important topic. I mean, I think the huge gratifying news we received about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, that they work, is fantastic. So that really tells us that the biology and a lot of these approaches are going to be successful. So for that, that's a huge win. Where the real challenge lies now is as Jenny mentioned, and Una as well, getting this vaccine to the entire population of the world. We're talking 8 billion people, and with a 2-dose vaccine, 16 billion doses. That's an incredible undertaking. And many areas, even in North America, are very rural and very difficult to get vaccines to. So we know, for instance, messaging from Canada, for instance, talking about the first rollout of the vaccines, panels have met to decide who should get it first. And of course, elderly folks at highest risk of severe disease and mortality are highest on the list. But we're faced with a vaccine that requires deep cold storage, can only be stored in the facility that it arrives in. They're actually asking these folks in long-term care to come to this central facility to get vaccinated. I think this is just exemplifies the challenge that we have. So we really need solutions that, like traditional vaccines that can be kept in the fridge. I mentioned DNA. We picked DNA because you can take DNA intact out of dinosaur bones that are hundreds of millions of years old. We know that our vaccine is stable at room temperature for over a month, stable in the fridge for over a year. And so we may not be the first through the gate at the end, but I think we're on track to provide a viable solution that can be transported all around the world.
Please respond to that, but also I would love to know a little bit more about your comment on sort of what are we preparing the vaccine for? Is it to prevent what level of disease and so on?
Well, I absolutely agree with and won't repeat what Jenny and John have said. When we were making vaccines for the developing world, we had this mantra that they needed to be oral, single dose, temperature stable, and low cost of goods. I think those were things to live by. I think those are huge goals. But as Jenny said, we may have to go back to some of the older technologies to get to all of those. And I don't think we should be ashamed of that at all. I even like some low-tech things. I was never against mosquito netting for malaria. But I think also we need to think about it in everything. I ran Diagnostics for All for a while, and there we were making very, very inexpensive diagnostics. And again, the mantra was no electricity, no refrigeration. Everything had to be done under $1. We could do it for under a penny, actually. And Jenny's point about a bicycle, transportation is not refrigerated trucks in the developing world. It's a woman walking to a clinic when she's already pregnant, or it's somebody on a bicycle distributing things to a village. And, we do live in a very developed country, but getting refrigerated trucks all around the US is not that easy. So we can learn some things from the developing world. And I think, again, we do really need to decide, this eternal struggle in life about the individual versus society. Are we just going to stop somebody from dying, even if they're still infectious? And we don't know that they are, but Moderna and Pfizer haven't yet really shown that people can't transmit afterwards, and that we should in fact wear masks after being vaccinated. So I do think that some of the older technologies also did manage to curb the spread of pandemics and epidemics. But I don't want to be too gloomy. Anything that reduces the reservoir in the population is good. But I don't think people right now, I think everybody is thinking about speed. They're not thinking about cost, and they're not thinking about what does it really mean for the pandemic. So those are the things I think still need work.
Fair enough, not a short list. Which actually kind of brings me to a question that we had talked about around the business considerations in reaching less wealthy parts of the world. I feel as though vaccines may not be invested in as heavily because there's this sense that you're not going to make a lot of money out of, or it's going to be more challenging to sell into global markets that particularly in underdeveloped areas. Jenny, can you touch on that, maybe what the opportunity or how you see the landscape of vaccine investing evolving?
Yeah, absolutely. And vaccines is a core investment strategy of Adjuvant. So I really hope I'm right, or else there will be no future funds for us. But anyways, to answer the question, look, we're a global health player, and the way that we think about business model approaches is, yes, you may be making on the margin smaller dollars per unit, but when you're selling these in hundreds of millions of doses, and I'm not talking about COVID, hundreds of millions of doses, even in childhood routine immunization programs around the world, you tend to make it up in volume. You have to, of course, assure yourself that there is a margin to be made. But when you're talking about, again, hundreds of millions, if not billions of doses, the business model does work out. And so that's actually a really, really important thing for us to consider. And then also another way that we try to have all these pieces fit together is we strike a lot of partnerships with the World Health Organization, UNICEF, multilateral organizations, the alphabet soups, the government agencies of the world, in securing really sticky purchase orders and supply chains. And so once you get, which is a huge feat, by the way, for example, World Health Organization pre-qualification, you automatically end up on some of these supply orders and purchase orders whereby somebody like UNICEF would be purchasing on a multi-year basis tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of doses. And so turn it around, if you're a small biotech company or even a medium-sized biotech company, $25 million purchase revenue contract will help your business model. And that's how we try to fit all the pieces around the world together.
Great. John, are you thinking about which markets you're going to try and enter, or how do you look at that?
Yeah, absolutely. One question we've got constantly is, since we're not one of the first ones to get approved, what is your business model going forward? And I alluded to it in my previous question. I mean, we're talking about 16 billion doses. Every manufacturing plant in the world working nonstop is not going to be able to make that for a good period of time. And we're already seeing this. I mean, with the warp speed and all the investment in manufacturing for the vaccines that are the front runners now, promising a certain number of doses, we're already seeing that, these were unrealistic expectations. So while we're on the cusp of having an approved vaccine, the number of these doses that will actually be available and distributed in the next 6 months, I think are going to be relatively underwhelming. So we're looking at a timeline of not 1 year. We're looking at a timeline of probably 5 years or more, even to get doses to the entire population. So we'll be with this for a while. It looks like there are going to need to be several kinds of different solutions to get to different parts of the world. So solutions that can be ideally kept at room temperature, maybe oral dosing or sublingual dosing, formulations that it can be refrigerated and use the existing flu vaccine infrastructure. And these solutions can be made available by companies over the next, I would say, 1.5 years as they move through clinical trials and still have a viable business case. And actually, I didn't answer your question, but and thinking about this, so obviously jurisdictions around the world are thinking about this, thinking when the vaccine will be available and how many doses, and is it appropriate to be manufactured in their jurisdiction and distributed in their jurisdictions, and we're very much having these conversations.
Right. Did you want to add something? I
Yes,
remember.
I really do think that one can make a business here, and of course we're all passionate about it. Thanks to the Gates Foundation and Welcome, UNICEF, USAID, and I found also the US military, one can get through the R&D. I think the business of sales is difficult. I was a huge proponent of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And this is really a tiered pricing model where the richer countries pay the most and probably carry most of the burden. The BRIC countries or the middling countries pay an intermediate price. And those at the lowest, levels of poverty by World Health and UN standards actually just pay a copay. And I think that has worked pretty well. But there are other ways. I mean, we also offered some of our vaccines, our antidiarrheal vaccines, as travelers' vaccines. And the military is expecting, the US military and others are expecting to fight wars in places where they've not traditionally fought wars, and they're all looking for vaccines in case epidemics or pandemics break out. I think the most difficult model is a pandemic, which may have an end, and how you keep warm-based manufacturing going in case there's another threat is, I think, a very difficult model. So I see the manufacturing piece as the problem for pandemics, but I do think you can make a business incorporating global health.
So does that mean that, I guess, going back to part of what I was asking about on the investment scene, do we think that this, if there is a renewed investment interest in vaccines, is that going to last, do you think? You've told me about these things maybe coming and going. What do you feel that
Well, it's an opportunity. I mean, I got into building a vaccines business when vaccines were really out of fashion, and therefore one could buy companies. I never saw myself quite, I was an R&D person, but as we needed new technologies or got into patent fights, I would just buy the companies. And so we were able to amass some wonderful vaccine technologies. Yes, I have invested in a vaccine company this year, but it tends to, I tend to like to add a very new, deep technology that I think will go way beyond the current pandemic. And unfortunately, things like, various forms of chronic disease and cancers are going to be with us for a long time. And the immune system is a very good way to target them and fight them. So yes, I do think there's a future. I'm not sure about for COVID vaccines, but for vaccines, yes.
Fantastic. And it does seem to me that we've seen, like in the case of John's company, companies and technologies that have been focused around oncology as a potentially more lucrative and investable market, kind of switching and maybe having the opportunity to switch back again. John, I wonder if you could talk about that kind of opportunity and synergy in how we approach different kinds of diseases, in fact.
No, I mean, that's a great point. So I think, thinking about the future of these kinds of technologies going beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, I mean, for us, the decision was really around, obviously, so the applications of our technology, it's a platform technology, gene therapy, mRNA, RNAi, there's very, very broad ways we could apply it. We've been thinking about infectious disease for a while, and Una brought it up as well. I mean, we're extremely interested in personalized cancer vaccines as well. So when the opportunity came to, with this obviously crippling pandemic to be able to apply this technology to something useful, we jumped on the opportunity. But we saw the opportunity not as a COVID-19 opportunity, but really an opportunity to build an infectious disease platform that could also include vaccines But one other thing we think is really important. So we talked about the protective and preventive side of things. I think the therapeutic, active intervention is also important. So we have programs in what's called vectored immunoprophylaxis. So you've heard of companies like Epsilor and others using antibodies to actively intervene in severe cases. And so, my vision is to be able to create genetic versions of all these technologies to be able to quickly respond to pandemics and things like COVID-19 to provide a genetic encoding of that antibody. So I think for us, we're looking to build a large infectious disease company based on these platform technologies that can now create solutions for different infectious diseases.
Jenny, I see you nodding your head there.
Yeah, no, look, as an investor, we like to have multiple shots on goal, and I know that's a totally overused idiom. But it's multiple shots on goal, not just because of the portfolio de-risking of it, but sometimes when you have a lead program like COVID that is able to prove out your platform technology with hopes that you will be able to repeat some of those lessons and repeat some of those learnings into future infectious disease, that resonates really, really well to me as an investor. And then also to a slightly tangential point about, in the context of COVID, some of our companies have been able to garner non-dilutive funding and grants to help with one specific program. But if you prove out that one specific program across the platform technology, there's actually, a benefit to be reaped in some of the other programs as well. So as an investor, platform technology is wonderful for infectious disease.
Great. I'm going to take a pause and actually address a few of the questions that have come up because they're really around the first part of our topic that we talked about in terms of cold chains. The first one is the flu vaccine development and distribution chain is pretty robust, able to evolve with the flu variants every year. How close or far are we from a similar ability for SARS-CoV-2? Does anybody want to jump on that question?
I can start. So I think there are several of the technologies in development that absolutely can be stored and distributed similar to the flu vaccine. And we don't fully understand the biology of SARS-CoV-2 yet. We may be looking at seasonal upticks in the virus, and we've already seen evidence of mutations. And there is also some evidence that perhaps some of the current vaccines won't be as effective against some of those mutations. So I think absolutely, while I'm not entirely sure that the mRNA approach is going to be the kind of approach that can work for this, we may build that infrastructure. I think absolutely many of the technologies can be stored in the fridge, including ours, and could use that existing infrastructure.
Great.
Hemi?
Yes.
I do think that we are going to be able to evolve technologies that will make SARS-CoV-2 vaccines compatible with the flu vaccines and make it possible for them to be given in the same way at CVS and Walgreens, etc. The thing that concerns me is this is a very strange virus, and I'd love to hear other people's input on this. Like other coronaviruses, it does seem to affect the lungs, one of my great areas of interest. But I get constant calls from physicians. I got 3 last night about long COVID or long haul COVID people, and people who have had none of the symptoms in the lungs, no coughing, wheezing, sneezing, did have a fever, but later had heart effects, had a stroke or other inflammation. And, being an endothelium person, I'm absolutely convinced that this is endothelial activation and inflammation. But I don't know yet, we certainly aren't evaluating the vaccines for those kind of long effects of COVID. And I think before the public gets too comfortable with thinking, oh, this is just like the flu and we can get the vaccine, we do need to think about the long-term sequelae and what we're going to do to manage COVID over people's lifetimes, especially since children are getting it. So that's just a sort of cautionary word.
John?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I've been reading the reports of this long COVID as well, and it's a little bit hard from the science to distinguish. It seems it's consequences of damage happening during the acute infection that may exist over time, and I'm absolutely in agreement with you, Una. This sounds like an endothelial, vascular, systemic kind of issue. the mechanism of which, is still yet to be figured out. But I think, that's I think that's a good explanation for why we're seeing these manifestations in different areas of the brain and the heart and other places. And it's going to take some science to figure out. But we have a lot of scientists that are keen on answering.
Speaking of science and its role in this, one of our attendees is asking, other than the regulatory agencies around the globe being willing to move fast, what are the key things that made developing a vaccine go from years to months in this case? Do you want to kick us off, given your comment that you're astonished and jealous of the timeline?
The FDA has overlooked a lot of the horrible things they did to us. I was unfortunate enough, and I think Jenny probably saw this when she was with the Gates Foundation, to develop a lot of anti-diarrheal vaccines. And for a while, even in developing world circles, I was known as the diarrhea queen. And Rotarix had a very unfortunate predecessor made by Wyeth that caused an extremely rare childhood horrible problem called intussusception, where the gut essentially twists, and I'm sure it's very painful for the babies. But it really is extremely rare. But the FDA said, and unfortunately Congress got into the act, that if we were going to bring out another rotavirus vaccine, which we did with GSK and Merck did on their own, that it would have to eliminate any worries about this very rare side effect, even though we were using technologies that I won't get into that were unlikely to cause that. The real problem was, and this is a problem for vaccines worldwide, is that the rate of that particular side effect varied across the world. It was very low in the US. It was quite high in Singapore and Malaysia. We didn't know how to power the trial to eliminate it. Luckily, my counterpart on the other side in GSK was Moncef Slaoui, a name you all know well now, and an incredibly competent vaccine person. But I mean, these are trials that then cost $800 million, take years, are too big for small biotechs to manage. So they partner with, big pharmas with deep pockets. And the FDA is paranoid. And I kept saying in those days, there are 600,000 children dying a year of rotavirus, and you are worrying about the 6 kids in the US, of which only 2 have died, of this rare side effect. But that's a horrible equation if you're the mother of one of those children. You're not worried about the other 600,000. The New England Journal later brought out that the rotavirus vaccines actually saved 2 million lives, because that was, there were all sorts of knock-on good effects, that the babies were less weak. But these are the big ethical questions that we have to worry about, but they're the ones that the FDA has to satisfy the public about. So while I kicked against it all the time, I'm glad we have an FDA. I'm glad we worry about these things. And but these are the things that delay approvals. None of this is going on now. We don't know what the rare side effects are. Heaven forbid there's a Guillain-Barré type side effect. I mean, allergic reactions we expect to see. Again, horrible if you have them, but we expect to see those with new vaccines, often new drugs. But we simply don't know. There isn't time to have looked at long-term or very rare side effects. And you don't see them until you get out into the population with millions of people. So that's the reason for the delay. That took a long time. And
that makes total sense. John, beyond sort of the regulatory timelines, can you speak to kind of the speed of the development timeline being accelerated in this context?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways, and I've said this on many panels and many interviews. So for the most part, except for obviously these rare complications, safety really hasn't been compromised at all. Where these are properly powered studies, given the timeline that we have, and where where companies are taking significant risks, and those risks are mitigated somewhat by funding from the government and other non-dilutive sources of funding, is doing multiple activities in parallel. So instead of drug development typically being discovery, which might take 3 or 4 years, and then your pre-IND enabling studies might take a year or two, and then you go into phase 1, and then the clinical trials take 8 years or so. That's why the typical development time for a vaccine is over 10 years. And as Una mentioned, it's incredibly expensive. So we've been able to speed up the process significantly by, number one, on the R&D side, making some really quick bets. So betting that the full-length spike protein is the right antigen to choose, right? So almost all of the companies that are the front runners have made that bet. So luckily that bet paid off. It looks like full-length spike protein can provide a protective immune response. But then, of course, betting on producing commercial manufacturing before they have even finished phase 1. So this is pretty much unheard of in drug development, making those bets, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build up that commercial manufacturing capacity. And again, organizing when you're in phase 1, organizing the phase 2, setting up the phase 3 sites, all in parallel, so that all of that can happen seamlessly if the data looks good and the safety looks good. And I would say the other challenge, with our team being in the trenches, is that we're actually trying to do this in a pandemic. So for instance, we have social distancing in the lab, we have people working day shifts and night shifts, obviously trying to protect themselves and their families while also working at breakneck speed to try to bring something through. So I just don't want to discount the human element. There are a lot of people really dedicated to making an impact on this and being a part of the solution.
Absolutely. And I think that what your point about the parallel processing and really everybody going all in has made a remarkable difference. Like, Jenny, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and both John and Una already touched upon this a little bit, but look, I'm an investor and I tend to be a hammer looking for a nail sometimes. So I oftentimes think it's about funding and financing and money at the end of the day. And, I'm sorry to say, but like investors, governments, nonprofit organizations, et cetera, have poured hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into this effort. Whereas, a year ago, Adjuvant and our other syndicate members were trying to raise, 10, 20, $30 million for various programs. So I don't want to diminish like the scale in which we're operating under in terms of funding is orders of magnitude off, and that accelerates things a lot. So.
Absolutely. So someone asks, is this going to be the new norm of vaccine development or just under this pandemic? You're shaking your head.
Well, I wish we got a huge stimulus package and the at-risk manufacturing for every project that every small biotech comes up with. It's not going to happen. But I think it's an appropriate response when you have a global scourge like this. And, for all the complaining about the government, and I'm much part of that, one thing is a huge amount of money, as Jenny says, has been really injected into the economy for this effort. And it has allowed that parallel processing that we're talking about that gives us efficiency. So I think we should probably give credit to that. But no, I mean, this can't happen for everything. And heaven forbid there's another terrible worldwide problem like this. And maybe it will happen again, but it's not the new normal.
John?
The only slightly hopeful thing I'd like to add is that because now teams have had to adapt to this rapidly moving environment, I think we've created structures, both on the biotech side and hopefully on the regulatory side, to be able to review things more quickly, to be able to be more efficient. And so we're hopefully looking at a future where we have more capacity, but more expertise to bring things through quicker.
Yeah.
And hopefully the money will follow, right, Jen?
Hopefully. So that brings me to, in some ways it seems that we've been very lucky with this virus, that, it generates its own immune response. It doesn't appear to mutate very quickly. It has these clearly defined, spike target, as you talked about, John. And, I still remember when we were hot to develop a vaccine against HIV and, which is obviously a much wilier subject. So where have we become more sophisticated in our manipulation of biology? Where has this, acceleration is sustained? And where are we still lacking on the basic science of vaccine development? John, do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Well, you alluded to it in your introduction. I think we're we're in an age of incredible innovation. And I think what we're seeing now is really the culmination of what started with the sequencing of the human genome and the development of these really key tools, like being able to manipulate viruses, like being able to, sequence and encode information and introduce that into the body to make new medicines. I think we're at the cusp of a complete revolution that is actually being ushered quickly forward by COVID. And I think this is a reason for incredible optimism. We now have the tools to be able to really address almost any disease through genetic means. And really what's been holding us back, I think, we have incredible lab tools to be able to manipulate the genome to express proteins and therapeutic proteins. Where we've been lacking are the formulation, the drug formulations, the delivery systems to be able to realize that. And gene therapy has had a boost from figuring out that AAVs, for instance, can deliver genes and be successful. But I think, AAV, for instance, is a very clunky gene therapy tool. I think these non-viral approaches are much more elegant. One of the reasons why, and a small plug for us, one of the reasons why we decided to combine sort of virus and non-virus approaches to create a gene therapy tool. But I think having brought some of these tools now through the COVID pandemic through clinical trials all the way to product approval, I think now we have a much bigger toolbox of tools now we can apply to many other diseases.
Great. But not all of them, surely. Where are the missing pieces? Or where are some of the missing pieces?
Yeah, so I think I kind of alluded to it. So if we're going to have successful gene therapies, we have to deal with repeat dosing. So the issue with all of these viral approaches is immunogenicity. So we really have to get the right dose the first time, and it needs to get all the cells and cure the disease. So I think we need to develop platforms that can be repeat dosed, and we're just seeing sort of an inkling of these being developed now. And cost of manufacturing, cost of goods, and being able to, I guess, democratize these technologies to many different areas. We're looking now at a lot of these gene therapies being, $1 million a treatment, and prohibitively expensive, particularly for anybody who isn't covered or has the money. So I think being able to bring these technologies to everyone, I think, is critical as well.
Absolutely. Jenny, asking it from a slightly different perspective, what do you look for when you're investing? What are you looking for in the problems that haven't been solved, for example, that you could get excited about to invest in?
Oh gosh, this is a little bit motherhood and apple pie, but of course, we're looking to develop answers to some of these global health challenges. And look, at the end of the day, we're a research and development fund, and we're looking for the next paradigm shift in terms of how to tackle some of these things. Because yes, there's the medium term or the shorter term things that we can do on the margin for, say, delivery of existing drugs or tweaking of existing drugs and vaccines. But what we're really looking for is kind of what's going to be the next platform technology in the next 5 to 10 years, such that you can effectuate, a 10x reduction in COGS, so you can be developing or delivering to all corners of the world. And then the other thing that we often look for is, we're passionate about global health. And so the teams that we work with also have to be passionate about global health. And so that kind of mission alignment with business alignment and making sure those two things are in lockstep and you don't necessarily have to choose one over the other is really important for Adjuvant as well. So.
Great. Do you see opportunities or challenges that we have yet to solve on the science side or the development side?
Yes, I think where biology doesn't give us a blueprint. I mean, I think I told you this I was asked once to give a lecture called The Impossible Dream. And I like to talk about things that I can do or have done. And it was about why haven't we made vaccines for AIDS, malaria, and TB? And I think what we have to do is go back, perhaps as Jenny said, to the mission. I'm a vaccines person, but vaccines may not be the approach for everything. Viruses and bacteria are very smart. And to be honest, I would bet on them in the long run, being able to evolve faster than some of our technologies. So I think we do have to think about managing some of these things with drugs. And some of the clues on how the drugs would work do come from immunology and the ways that vaccines work. And then, there are the low-tech things, as I said, we're still going to have to wear masks. Mosquito nets work quite well. Filtering water through 2 thicknesses of sari seem to work quite as well, for cholera. So I think we shouldn't be pig-headed about vaccines. They aren't going to solve everything, but our science and our smarts will.
Amen to that. By the way, someone on the panel says, tell Jenny to let her kids say hi. It's great that she's curious about mom's work.
You get back in because of that comment. My daughter's on recess. She's on Zoom kindergarten.
Awesome.
Anyways.
Jenny, I wanted to ask you actually, because Una's point about different, not just focusing on vaccines. I know that you had talked about diagnostics and the role of diagnostics in this, in terms of, not only the success of the businesses, but also the importance of it. Can you speak to that a little bit in the context of, COVID and beyond?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, one of our product categories that we invest in oftentimes is just diagnostics, and specifically infectious disease diagnostics. And as we could all tell, and if you've lined up at a COVID-19 testing line, diagnostics can have a lot of different issues in terms of just making sure that they're accurate, making sure that the turnaround time is quickly enough, making sure that it's low cost enough such that you can get repeated diagnostic tests. So we think about diagnostics in almost like companion diagnostics, which is a technical term, but just we have to be pursuing some of these paths in terms of both drugs and vaccines and diagnostics in parallel, because you really can't have one or the other, because you're not going to be in a position to, if there is a COVID drug that is available, to just blast it out to everybody. You want to be able to be very sparing with your resources, and diagnostics is the key to unlocking that.
Did you want anything? I know that you've been involved in diagnostics efforts as well.
Well, I'm hugely involved with that, and very warmly acknowledge the support of the Gates Foundation to Diagnostics for All. But that was what we were trying to do, was make very, very inexpensive diagnostics that could be used, because they would prevent the misuse of drugs. Very often, pharma companies will give, on a compassionate basis, almost outdated drug. And children who had a fever were often given antimalarials when they didn't really need them. That only increases side effects, wastes drugs, huge problems. But diagnostics are not really used much in the developing world, because they're considered by the ministers of health to be too expensive. So we really had to come in with something cheap and easy. And I'm a great believer in point of care. So I think in the context of COVID, the closer we can get to self-testing at home, like pregnancy testing, the better, even if we have to go with a little bit of uncertainty and repeat testing if it's not accurate.
Makes sense. Li Sheng, our co-moderator, is asking, or our host is asking, why weren't most of the scientific community very optimistic about the early leading vaccine candidates just months ago, which ended up with these great results? We would have hosted this panel earlier if we'd had the crystal ball rather than going with the consensus. John, do you have any thoughts about why these new vaccines were not necessarily embraced up front?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I think a lot of people had hope that they would work. I think in the absence of good information, you start to roll these things around in your head, and I think that's really what happened. Discussing all of the ways things can go wrong, especially with all of this. Everybody needs this to work, right? We're all of our lives are impacted so incredibly. Both economically and from a health-related perspective. And I think everybody wanted it to work. But again, you're in a situation where you've invested a ton of money in maybe a very few companies, and we got lucky. I think we got lucky that the first technologies we tried worked. I think it could have gone completely the other way, and I'm very happy that it worked out the way it did.
Excellent. So we only have about another 5 minutes or so. I'd love for each of you to spend a minute or two giving, some closing thoughts on the discussion we've had, any points that I didn't ask you about that you'd like to touch on. Jenny, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I tend to always want to look for the silver lining in any kind of situation. And of course, COVID-19 has been a terrible human cost. And, my daughter is in Zoom kindergarten, which does not work, by the way, for all those with young children. But, I do love this kind of renowned focus on infectious disease, this renowned focus on making sure that these healthcare technologies are accessible for all, because we're so interconnected. If we don't solve the issue in India, we're not going to solve the issue in the US. And I think that kind of spirit is now so top of mind for everybody. And I think that would be perhaps one of the longer lasting things after this pandemic is over. You're going to have a generation of people who remember vividly what it means to be masking, not just yourself, but for other people, social distancing, and making sure that you invest in the next generation of scientists who is still poking her head into my office. So there you go.
Awesome.
I too see very much opportunity from this crisis. I think one of the things that's really heartening is the interest in biology that people haven't really had before. And I get questions and invitations to speak to groups who would never have paid any attention to what I said, were it not for this. So I think, people trying to understand the biology behind COVID is extraordinarily positive. I think the other thing is that we really have learned in business to build teams, to collaborate via Zoom or across the world. If you think about how we used to behave, a few of us would get on planes, burning up jet fuel, going to meetings all over the place to meet with maybe at the most half a dozen people, sometimes 2 or 3, sometimes 20. But now you can gather as we are now and get opinions from all around the world. They're like team members. They have inputs. There's much more diversity of input. And so I see those as the changes that I would like to see last into the future.
Amen. John.
Yeah, so I have 3 points to make. I think one thing that's really been heartening, dealing with this pandemic is this idea of prevention, right? So vaccines are all about, they're not about treating a disease, but they're preventing it from happening. And I think this is a theme that is really becoming very important in healthcare in general. How are we going to prevent heart disease, all of these age-related diseases that our society is grappling with in real time. And I think pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies are beginning now to have the tools to be able to grapple with this, thinking about things that address age-related disease, senolytics, for instance, gene therapies and drugs that kill senescent cells to decrease the damage of aging. I think this idea that we can use technology to address the decline as we age and the prevention of all these diseases that ravage our society, I think is really important. The second point, completely unrelated, is we've really learned, especially in a country-specific basis, that we do not have in-house manufacturing to be able to rapidly respond to this kind of need for vaccines and therapeutics. And I think, being Canadian and sort of seeing how Canada responded, they basically defunded all of their vaccine manufacturing 5 to 10 years ago and rapidly tried to refund it. It takes 2 or 3 years to build up the capacity. And I think countries really need to think about in-house manufacturing capacity for therapeutics and vaccines to address pandemics. The final thing I just want to sort of build on what Una and Jenny mentioned, it was about, this is great evidence that if we put a substantial investment in innovation pays back in strides. And it's because we have amazing tools, discovery in science, we have amazing scientists, and we now have the ability to collaborate across the world. So I think we should be, patting ourselves on the back that, even with a substantial investment and a coordinated effort, passionate effort, we've been able to solve these problems in a record time. And there's no reason we can't apply that to many other societal and disease issues.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you all. I have learned so much in preparing for this panel and for interacting with you today. I personally really appreciate all of you taking the time, and I know that our audience and our future audience in video online will too. So with that, I will return it to Li Sheng, our host.
Well, I just wanted to say, I can't say enough thanks to everyone. I personally enjoyed this panel discussion so much, I wish it never end. And I still have a few questions of my own. I might call upon you guys and just individually. But this has been great. Thank you so much for being part of the panel. And just a shameless plug-in here, under the pandemic, hopefully, now locked down in many states, yeah, please come to these virtual panels and you can see the value from these for both investors, for entrepreneurs alike. So hopefully to see you the next panel. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful Friday.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. It was wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.